One of the first great works by Michelangelo is going to be his Pieta. Now, it's an unusual subject. It's not something we usually see in Italy. This is actually primarily a northern subject, so rather unusual. Although this can be explained by the fact that he's working for a French cardinal at the time who will commission the work. So this is going to be important. He's borrowing northern themes, which is not unusual. Usually, as I've spoken about before, the person commissioning the art gets a huge say over exactly how it's done. There are a couple of other interesting things here before we dive into some of the specific elements. This is pretty much the only time you're going to see Michelangelo polish a piece of stone, because when he's done, he looks at it and goes, this is not really very realistic with it highly polished. This is also a piece during the point where Michelangelo is fairly unknown, and it is said that this is the piece that will cause everyone to look at the old St. Peter's and desire a new St. Peter's to be built. So let's look at it. First of all, let's talk about Mary's strength. Look at the way she's holding Jesus. Now, what's happened, this is the Pietà. Jesus has just been taken off the cross. He's been handed to his mother, who's holding him. And the way she's holding him is very reminiscent of how someone would hold, say, a 3 or 4-year-old or a child with one arm. But this is a 33-year-old male, a fully grown adult, which means he's quite heavy. And it's showing Mary's strength, a stoic sense of strength, because at the time it was believed that Mary knew what was going to happen to Jesus. She knew that she would outlive him. And that takes a certain stoic determination to get through life with that knowledge and not pass that on to the child, not let that affect how you interact with the child. Secondly, we have the issue of Mary's age. When you look at the sculpture and you look at her age, she looks incredibly young. And that's odd because let's do some quick math. Let's assume Jesus is 33. And let's assume, because we don't really want to get into some of the more realistic scenarios, let's assume Mary is 18 when she gives birth. Now we know Jesus is 33 when he dies. So that makes her 51 years old. However, that face is that of maybe a 15, 16, 17-year-old, maybe an 18-year-old. Very, very young. Why? Because, well, again, it's dogma. It's going back to Christian teaching, which teaches that Mary is the only human to have never sinned. Jesus sinned. He runs away from his parents to argue with the Pharisees at the temple. There are a couple of other incidents. So he sins, but she never does. And so she never ages, or at least that's what Michelangelo is trying to get across, which really brings a question to mind. What's Grandma been doing all these years? Sorry, moving on. So it gives us this sense of ethereal delicacy. It also is interesting because the wounds in the hands and the side, and they're really hard to see here. Here you can see the wound in the hand, the wound in the side from the spear. Those wounds are really, really minor. And that's kind of unusual, especially when you're used to, for example, the Spanish tradition, where they would be massive and bleeding and horrible to get across the physical suffering. This isn't about physical suffering. One last thing to point out, this is the only piece that Michelangelo will sign. Legend has it that he overhears people talking about the piece, and they're actually accrediting it to another sculptor at the time. So he breaks into the old St. Peter's and carves his name into it before leaving again. And so here we see Michelangelo Bonardi of Florence. So is it true? Who knows? But it makes for a good story, and it is the only time he signs a work. So remember I said it's not about the physical suffering. The entire piece is really about psychology and psychological suffering, something that we would expect from the Greeks during the Hellenistic, for example. But Michelangelo is bringing these very emotional, very difficult issues back in this sculpture. And who's suffering? It's not Jesus's. After all, he's dead, so he's not really feeling much. But it's Mary's. And it's interesting because she takes on the main role in this piece. Jesus played a role, but there's nothing there anymore. Mary, on the other hand, shows us what a mother should do and how a mother should react in the stoicism that was so central to Christianity for so much of its history.